Most of us move into neighborhoods hoping for peace and community. But what if the very group meant to protect your home value turned into your biggest nightmare? That's the reality for millions of Americans living under homeowners associations, or HOAs. On paper, they're supposed to keep lawns trimmed and streets looking nice. But in practice, some HOAs have gone completely off the rails, enforcing rules so absurd, cruel, and downright ridiculous that they ruin lives and make headlines. Imagine being forced to keep your garage door wide open all day, leaving your home vulnerable to burglars, or buying a $70,000 luxury electric truck, only to be told it's a commercial vehicle and banned from your own driveway. One widow even woke up on the morning of her husband's funeral to find her cars towed because of an HOA president who thought rules mattered more than compassion. And it gets worse. A man was fined $33,000 and threatened with foreclosure just for parking his beloved classic truck because the HOA claimed its patina finish was damage. And perhaps the most unbelievable of all, a woman was fined $100 because the imprint her car left in the snow was considered offensive. These aren't urban legends. They're real HOA horror stories. And today, we're counting down the 5 craziest cases of HOA power gone wrong. Story 5, the open garage rule. What happens when your HOA forces you to leave your garage wide open all day, making your home an open invitation for burglars? Imagine waking up, pouring your morning coffee, and heading out the door for work, only to realize that your entire garage, filled with your bike, your tools, maybe even your car, has to stay wide open for the next 8 hours. Not just today, not just this week, but every single weekday. Anyone walking down your street can look directly inside, take inventory of your belongings, and see an easy entry point into your home. It sounds like something out of a burglar's dream, but for residents of one Auburn, California community, this wasn't paranoia. This was their homeowners association rule. The HOA claimed it was cracking down on residents who had converted their garages into living spaces. Some were allegedly being used as extra bedrooms, rental units, or game rooms. According to the deed restrictions, garages were supposed to be reserved for cars and storage only, not people. On paper, the HOA's concern didn't sound unreasonable, but the way they chose to enforce it was nothing short of extreme. Instead of investigating suspected violations or working case by case, the HOA board decided that the only way to keep garages pure was to require every resident to keep their garage doors open from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Monday through Friday. The idea was simple. With the garage exposed all day, nobody could secretly live inside. But the residents immediately saw the problem. Most people worked during those hours, meaning their homes would be unguarded while their garages sat fully exposed to the public. Garages aren't just places for cars. They're full of bicycles, tools, sports equipment, kids' toys, and expensive gear. Many also serve as the main entry point into the home, with doors that lead directly into kitchens or hallways. Those doors are usually flimsy compared to front doors, meaning that a burglar could bypass the whole house alarm system simply by walking through the garage. One resident told a local reporter they might as well hand out flyers to thieves saying, "Come shop here." Despite the obvious risks, the HOA doubled down. Residents who refused to comply were slapped with $200 fines. For many, paying the fine seemed safer than leaving their homes vulnerable to theft or worse. It didn't take long for this absurd rule to draw attention outside the neighborhood. News stations picked up the story, showing images of entire rows of houses with open garages, like a bizarre art installation of vulnerability. Viewers were stunned. Commentators ridiculed the HOA's logic, pointing out that while they were trying to stop a few people from breaking a minor rule, they had created a much larger public safety hazard for everyone. The story spread quickly on social media, where people mocked the idea and compared it to dystopian open house scenarios. Memes circulated, showing burglars thanking the HOA for making their jobs easier. The pressure worked. Within weeks of the news reports going viral, the Auburn HOA board announced they were rescinding the rule. Residents could once again close their garage doors without fear of punishment. The HOA promised to come up with a more reasonable policy in the future, though no such policy was ever publicized. It was a rare example of an HOA being forced to admit defeat, largely because their actions had turned the entire neighborhood into a national laughingstock. From the HOA's perspective, they were simply enforcing deed restrictions. They didn't want people turning garages into apartments or Airbnbs, which could hurt property values. But their approach reflected a classic case of collective punishment. Instead of addressing a handful of offenders, they forced the entire community to comply with a rule that put everyone's security at risk. It also revealed a stunning lack of common sense. The purpose of an HOA is supposed to be preserving home values and improving community safety. But what could possibly lower a neighborhood's appeal faster than requiring everyone to expose their personal belongings to strangers? Any prospective buyer visiting the community during the day would immediately see rows of open garages and question whether this was a safe or sane place to live. The Auburn garage door debacle is often cited as a textbook example of HOA overreach. It demonstrates how small groups of board members can enact sweeping rules without fully considering the real-world consequences. It also shows the importance of residents pushing back and of public exposure. Left unchecked, this rule might have remained in place indefinitely. But once homeowners voiced their concerns to the media, the HOA was forced to retreat. Finally, it highlights the need for balance in community governance. Rules are sometimes necessary to keep neighborhoods orderly, but when enforcement requires neighbors to sacrifice basic security and privacy, the rule has already failed. The Auburn, California garage story is more than just a silly anecdote about overzealous rule-making. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when an HOA loses sight of its purpose and starts enforcing rules for the sake of control rather than community well-being. For the residents, it was a frustrating ordeal. For the rest of us, it's a reminder to always read the fine print, and maybe to think twice before moving into an HOA community. Because sometimes the people making the rules aren't protecting you. They're leaving your garage door wide open. Story 4. The electric truck ban. This man bought a $70,000 luxury electric truck only to have his HOA call it a commercial vehicle and ban it from his own driveway. Picture this. You've lived in a quiet, upscale neighborhood for nearly 3 decades. You've paid your dues, mowed your lawn, followed the rules, and never had an issue with your homeowners association. Then one day, you treat yourself to something special. A brand new Rivian R1T, one of the world's first luxury all-electric pickup trucks. Sleek, silent, environmentally friendly, and costing upwards of $70,000, it's the kind of vehicle that turns heads for all the right reasons. But instead of compliments from your neighbors, you get a warning letter. According to your HOA, that shiny, futuristic Rivian isn't a luxury vehicle at all. It's a commercial truck, and unless you can somehow squeeze it into your already packed garage, you're breaking the rules. Suddenly, your dream car has become the centerpiece of an absurd battle, one that pits common sense against HOA stubbornness. The man at the center of this dispute was Glenn Gordon, a resident of the Weston Hills Country Club community in Florida. Gordon had lived there for 27 years without incident. He'd seen neighbors come and go, and he knew the HOA's rules well enough. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what happened when he brought home his Rivian. For Gordon, the truck wasn't just a car. It was a step into the future, a fully electric pickup that blended utility with cutting-edge technology. He didn't buy it to haul construction equipment or advertise a business. He bought it because he loved the design, the eco-friendly benefits, and the fact that it represented progress. Like many communities, Weston Hills had bylaws prohibiting residents from parking certain types of vehicles in driveways. Specifically, they banned trucks, trailers, RVs, and commercial vehicles of any kind unless they were stored inside a garage. The purpose of such a rule is easy enough to understand. HOAs don't want the neighborhood to look like a construction site or a storage yard. They want clean driveways and tidy appearances. But in Gordon's case, the HOA decided that his personal Rivian pickup fell under the category of commercial vehicle. The problem? His garage didn't have enough space to fit it, so the HOA told him he was in violation. The absurdity of the claim. To anyone with a shred of common sense, calling a Rivian R1T a commercial vehicle is laughable. This isn't an old work truck with ladders strapped to the roof. It's a luxury electric vehicle, the type marketed to eco-conscious professionals and adventure enthusiasts. If anything, it's closer in spirit to a Tesla than to a contractor's F-250. But the HOA wasn't budging. When Gordon pushed back, the association doubled down, insisting that he should have known the rules when he moved in. One HOA president was even quoted as saying, "If the gentleman would have read the documents when he bought the home, he would have seen that." The snarky response only fueled the perception that the HOA was out of touch and on a power trip. The fight escalates. Rather than quietly moving his truck or selling it, Gordon decided to stand up for himself, and he had good reason. There was already legal precedent showing that personal pickup trucks should not be considered commercial vehicles. In a remarkably similar case, another homeowner had taken their HOA to court after being cited for parking a personal truck in the driveway. The court sided with the homeowner, ruling that pickup trucks, when not used for business purposes or bearing commercial signage, are personal vehicles, not commercial ones. Not only did the homeowner win, but the HOA in that case was ordered to pay nearly $40,000 in legal fees. Armed with this knowledge, Gordon resisted the HOA's pressure. Why this matters on the surface, this may seem like a petty dispute about parking, but the Rivian case struck a nerve because it highlighted how outdated HOA rules can clash with modern technology and lifestyles. When many of these bylaws were written, pickup truck conjured images of worksite haulers caked in mud, dented from years of labor, and used for transporting lumber or tools. They were seen as utilitarian, not luxurious. But times have changed. Today, pickup trucks are among the most popular vehicles in America, and many, from the Ford F-150 Platinum to the Rivian R1T, are luxury purchases with price tags rivaling or exceeding high-end sedans. They're family cars, status symbols, and in the case of Rivian, even futuristic gadgets. Yet some HOAs are still operating on decades-old assumptions. The bigger picture. What makes this story particularly frustrating is the selective enforcement. Drive through almost any HOA neighborhood, and you'll likely see SUVs, crossovers, and minivans that are just as large, if not larger, than Gordon's Rivian. Yet nobody considers a Chevy Suburban or a Toyota Sequoia to be a commercial vehicle. So why target a Rivian? Many argue it comes down to control. HOA boards often gain reputations for being less about protecting property values and more about asserting authority. The Rivian became a symbol not of a vehicle in violation, but of a resident daring to question the HOA's power. The story spread quickly, especially because Rivian itself is a hot topic in automotive circles. EV enthusiasts were outraged that such an innovative vehicle could be punished under outdated rules. Car blogs, forums, and news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a classic battle between progress and bureaucracy. Many neighbors also sided with Gordon, noting that the truck was clean, modern, and far from an eyesore. In fact, some said it enhanced the community's image rather than detracting from it. While Gordon's specific case didn't make it into a courtroom, at least not publicly, the legal precedent was clear. Homeowners in similar situations had won, and HOAs had been forced to pay up. The very idea of calling a Rivian R1T a commercial truck became a cautionary tale about how rigid rulebooks can create absurd outcomes. At the end of the day, Gordon's fight was about more than a truck. It was about freedom, common sense, and the right to enjoy your property without being harassed by arbitrary interpretations of outdated rules. The Rivian case is remembered not because of the vehicle itself, but because of what it represented: the collision between modern life and antiquated HOA regulations. It showed how easily an HOA could take something as ordinary as a personal car and turn it into a violation, all while ignoring context, reason, and fairness. For residents in HOA communities, it was a wake-up call. For everyone else, it was yet another example of why HOAs have such a notorious reputation. And for Glenn Gordon, it was proof that sometimes the scariest thing about buying a brand new luxury car isn't the price tag. It's your HOA deciding they don't like the look of it in your driveway. Story 3. The widow's car towed. On the morning of her husband's funeral, a grieving widow walked outside to find her cars towed, by order of her HOA. Grief has a way of making everything in life feel heavier. The simple tasks, waking up, making breakfast, even stepping outside, can feel impossible when you've just lost the person you built your life with. That's the place Dory Clay found herself in as she prepared for her husband Richard's funeral. She wasn't worried about HOA rules or fines or parking spaces. She was simply trying to get through one of the hardest days of her life. But instead of compassion from her community, she got cruelty. On the very morning of her husband's funeral, she walked outside to discover that her cars had been towed. The order? Issued by her homeowners association president, who knew Richard had died, but enforced the rule anyway. It wasn't just a violation of common sense, it was a violation of basic humanity. Dory and Richard Clay lived in an HOA-governed community. Like many neighborhoods under HOA oversight, parking rules were strict. Guest spaces had time limits, and cars weren't supposed to remain in the same spot for more than a month. On paper, this might sound fair. Nobody wants abandoned cars clogging up community parking lots. But rules are only as good as the judgment used to enforce them. And in this case, judgment was sorely lacking. Richard's death was sudden and devastating. As Dory tried to navigate the painful process of funeral arrangements, her focus was anywhere but on HOA bylaws. She had parked her cars in guest spots temporarily while she managed the chaos of planning the service. On the morning of Richard's funeral, Dory stepped outside, only to discover both her vehicles were gone. At first, she thought they had been stolen. But soon she learned the truth. The HOA president had ordered them towed. Her shock quickly turned into anger. The president knew her husband had passed away. The community was aware, yet instead of showing compassion, the HOA chose that exact moment to enforce a minor technicality. When confronted, the HOA president claimed the cars had been in guest parking for more than 30 days. That was the official reason, but Dory disputed the claim, saying her vehicles hadn't been sitting there that long. Even worse, she accused the HOA of selective enforcement. Other cars, she pointed out, had been parked for long periods, some gathering dust, weeds, and even cobwebs. Yet they were never towed. Why hers? Why now? The answer seemed obvious: either spite, indifference, or a sheer obsession with rules over people. The story caught the attention of local reporters, who went straight to the HOA president's door for answers. Instead of offering sympathy or even a calm explanation, the president doubled down, angrily shouting the rules at journalists and refusing to acknowledge the human tragedy behind the situation. When asked if she knew Richard had died, the president admitted she had heard rumors but brushed them off. Her attitude was clear. The only thing that mattered was the freaking rule. The footage was shocking. A grieving widow had lost her cars on the morning of her husband's funeral, and the HOA president was shown on camera defending the decision with zero compassion. The one silver lining came from an unlikely source: the towing company. The owner, Chris Casal of All Count Towing, heard what had happened and stepped in to help. He waived the towing fees and offered to return the cars to Dory free of charge. But Dory declined. Instead, Casal helped her sell the vehicles to raise money for expenses, her original goal all along. In a way, the towing company, often seen as the villain in these situations, ended up being the only party to show her kindness. This story resonated far beyond one Florida community because it revealed something deeply troubling. Some HOAs seem to value rules more than people. Yes, bylaws are important. Yes, consistency matters. But when an HOA chooses to enforce a technical parking rule against a grieving widow on the day of her husband's funeral, it crosses a line from regulation into cruelty. Most people understand that life doesn't always fit neatly into rule books. Emergencies happen, grief happens, and part of living in a community is showing compassion in those moments. This HOA did the opposite. Dory's claim of selective enforcement struck a chord. Many HOA horror stories stem from the fact that rules aren't enforced equally. One neighbor gets cited for weeds in the yard while another is ignored. One person gets fined for a cracked driveway while another is left alone. This inconsistency breeds resentment. In Dory's case, it went beyond resentment. It felt like targeted cruelty. Seeing other long-abandoned cars left untouched while hers were towed made it clear the HOA president had chosen to enforce the rule when it hurt most. Public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Viewers were appalled by the lack of empathy. The story went viral in local media, serving as yet another cautionary tale about HOA overreach. For Dory, the damage was done. No apology or justification could erase the humiliation of losing her cars while preparing to bury her husband. For the HOA, the episode became a PR disaster. Instead of being seen as protectors of property values, they were painted as heartless enforcers of rules no sane person would prioritize in that moment. The story of Dory Clay's cars being towed is remembered not just as an example of bad HOA behavior, but as a symbol of what happens when rules replace humanity. An HOA exists to build community, to preserve order, and to make neighborhoods pleasant. But when the people enforcing the rules forget compassion, they don't just fail their mission, they betray it. For Dory, the day of her husband's funeral should have been about saying goodbye. Instead, it became yet another reminder that sometimes the worst conflicts we face don't come from strangers, but from the very communities meant to support us. And in this case, the HOA showed that their loyalty was never to their neighbors. It was only to the rule book. Story 2, the classic truck and foreclosure threat. A homeowner was fined $33,000 and threatened with foreclosure just because his HOA didn't like the look of his classic truck. Most people dream of owning a classic car, something with history, character, and a story written in every dent and scratch. For some, it's a cherry red Corvette. For others, a Mustang or an old Chevy. For Andy Lipka, it was his Ford F-250 pickup, a truck that had seen decades of use but still ran like a dream. It wasn't shiny or polished. It wore a natural patina, that weathered, faded look that collectors pay thousands to replicate. But Andy's pride and joy soon became his nightmare. To him, the patina was beautiful. To his homeowners association, it was moderately severe body damage. And their response wasn't just a warning or a fine. They threatened to foreclose on his home unless he got rid of it. This wasn't a debate about cars. It was about control, personal freedom, and just how far an HOA will go to prove a point. To understand this story, you have to understand patina. In car culture, patina refers to the natural wear that develops over decades. Faded paint, light surface rust, worn trim. For enthusiasts, it's not a flaw, it's a badge of honor. It shows authenticity. Many collectors even go out of their way to artificially create a patina finish. They sand, strip, and age the paint to mimic what time does naturally. In fact, cars with genuine patina often sell for more money than those that have been freshly painted. So when Andy proudly parked his Ford F-250 with its patina finish in his Missouri driveway, he saw a classic. His HOA saw an eyesore. Andy lived in a community governed by the Woodfield Homes Association. Their bylaws prohibited vehicles with moderately severe body damage from being parked in driveways. The rule was likely written to prevent abandoned junk cars or rusty wrecks from lowering curb appeal. But instead of applying this rule to true beaters or derelicts, the HOA decided Andy's patina finish counted as damage. It didn't matter that the truck ran perfectly. It didn't matter that it was well maintained. It didn't matter that car enthusiasts across the country would drool over it. In the eyes of the HOA, it was damaged property, and therefore not welcome. At first, Andy assumed this was a misunderstanding. Surely once he explained that the patina was intentional and even desirable, the HOA would drop the issue. But instead, the opposite happened. The HOA slapped him with escalating fines, eventually totaling $33,000. When Andy refused to pay, they went nuclear. They filed a lawsuit to foreclose on his house. Think about that. Over a truck that wasn't broken, wasn't abandoned, and wasn't harming anyone, Andy's entire homeownership was put at risk. Andy fought back, claiming the HOA was harassing him and unfairly targeting his truck. He pointed out the obvious flaw in their argument. If patina is considered damage, then every collector car with an aged finish would be illegal. Yet, in car culture, patina is not only accepted, but celebrated. He also highlighted the inconsistency in enforcement. Were every scratched minivan, every dented SUV, every rusty undercarriage in the neighborhood being cited? Of course not. The HOA had decided to make an example out of him and his Ford. The heart of the debate came down to one question. Is patina damage or is it style? Car enthusiasts around the world argue that patina is part of a vehicle's story. It shows it hasn't been over-restored or covered up. It's honest. It's real. Many collectors spend small fortunes creating the look that Andy's truck had naturally. But to the HOA, nuance didn't matter. They weren't evaluating the truck based on cultural or collector value. They were applying a rule by the letter, and doing so in the most extreme way possible. What made this case so shocking wasn't just the fines, but the escalation to foreclosure. HOAs have extraordinary legal power. When you move into an HOA community, you agree to abide by their rules. That agreement gives them authority not only to fine you, but in some states, to place liens on your property and even foreclose if you don't pay. That's exactly what happened to Andy. The HOA argued that his unpaid $33,000 in fines justified seizing his home. Over a truck. When Andy's story hit the news, it sparked outrage. Car enthusiasts, legal experts, and everyday homeowners weighed in, almost unanimously siding with Andy. How could a functioning, collectible vehicle be considered damaged? Why was an HOA willing to ruin a man's life over something so trivial? The story spread beyond Missouri, fueling the already growing movement of people questioning the fairness and power of HOAs. Andy's case wasn't just about a truck. It was about the broader issue of how much power HOAs should have. Most people join communities with HOAs thinking they'll get manicured lawns, nice amenities, and higher property values. But they don't always realize that HOAs can also impose rules that strip away personal freedom, from what color you can paint your house to what car you can park in your own driveway. Andy's ordeal showed how those powers can be abused. Instead of protecting the community, the HOA turned into a bully, prioritizing aesthetics over fairness and enforcement over humanity. At the end of the day, Andy Lipka's Ford F-250 wasn't just a truck. It was a symbol of individuality, history, and car culture. To him, it was a treasure. To his HOA, it was trash. That clash of perspectives nearly cost him his home. Whether you love classic cars or not, the story strikes a nerve. Because if an HOA can decide that a well-maintained running vehicle is damaged, what else can they decide? And how far are they willing to go to enforce it? And for the rest of us, it's a reminder. Sometimes the biggest threat to your dream home isn't crime, weather, or bad luck. It's your HOA. Story 1, the snow print fine. And finally, perhaps the most ridiculous of all, a woman was fined $100 because the imprint her car left in the snow was deemed offensive. Snow has a funny way of transforming the world. Overnight, an ordinary street becomes a winter wonderland. Every footprint, every tire track, every car parked overnight leaves a temporary imprint, little reminders that people were there. For most of us, it's harmless, even magical. But for one Tennessee woman named Catherine, that innocent imprint in the snow became the center of one of the most absurd HOA disputes ever recorded. Here's what happened. Catherine parked her Honda outside during a snowstorm. The next morning, she drove away, leaving behind the faint outline of her car in the snow. To her, it was nothing. To her homeowners association, it was an offensive image, one so inappropriate, they fined her $100. Yes, you read that right. A snow imprint was deemed vulgar, and the HOA decided it was her fault. Catherine lived in an HOA community in Tennessee where rules about appearances were notoriously strict. Residents had long been fined for things like uncut grass, faded mailboxes, or leaving trash cans out too long. But nothing could have prepared her for the day she received an email accusing her of displaying offensive images or slogans. At first, she thought it was a mistake. She hadn't hung up a flag, spray-painted her house, or even decorated for the holidays. Confused, she read further, and that's when she saw the attached photo. It was her parking spot, freshly dusted with snow, showing nothing more than the faint silhouette of where her car had been. The HOA claimed the outline resembled something obscene. The HOA fined her $100 for violating the clause about offensive images or slogans. The email even stated that residents had complained, claiming the imprint was inappropriate for children to see. Catherine was dumbfounded. It wasn't a drawing, it wasn't intentional, and it wasn't even permanent. Snow melts, tire tracks disappear. Yet here she was, being penalized for something completely out of her control. The weather. Incredibly, the HOA doubled down. In their email, they wrote, "Your car, specifically the Honda, left this offensive image on the ground after you left. Residents have filed complaints out of concern for younger residents. We expect you to understand why this has resulted in a fine." Think about that for a moment. Instead of focusing on actual community issues, board members were studying snow prints in the parking lot and interpreting them like ink blots in a psychology test. Catherine didn't back down. She refused to pay the fine, calling it absurd. She also threatened legal action, pointing out that there was no way she could have controlled the imprint left by her car in freshly fallen snow. Her stance gained traction online. She shared her story with The Drive, an automotive news outlet, providing copies of the HOA's emails as proof. Readers were stunned, then outraged. Social media erupted with laughter and disbelief. Memes spread like wildfire, joking about snow crimes and the dangers of winter weather offending delicate HOA sensibilities. Faced with public ridicule and Catherine's threat of legal action, the HOA quickly backed down. They dropped the fine and quietly tried to put the matter to rest. But the damage was done. The story went viral, cementing itself as one of the most ridiculous HOA overreach cases ever reported. On the surface, this story seems like a funny anecdote, the kind of thing you share at a party to get a laugh. But at its core, it highlights something troubling about HOAs, the ability to enforce rules subjectively. The bylaw Catherine was accused of breaking wasn't about snow. It was about offensive images or slogans. That rule might make sense if someone painted graffiti on their garage or put up an explicit sign. But in this case, board members stretched it to cover something completely natural and unintentional. This selective, creative enforcement is what makes many people uneasy about HOAs. If a snow print can be considered a violation, then technically anything can be. HOAs are given wide latitude to interpret and enforce rules. While homeowners can fight back in court, the cost and stress of litigation often deter people from pushing back. Many simply pay the fine, even when it's unfair, just to avoid conflict. Catherine's case shows what happens when someone refuses to accept nonsense. Her refusal to pay, paired with media exposure, forced the HOA to retreat. But not everyone has the time, energy, or resources to take a stand like that. Stories like this reinforce the perception that HOAs are less about preserving communities and more about giving small groups of people too much power. Instead of focusing on meaningful issues like safety, maintenance, or neighborhood improvement, some boards nitpick trivialities, even to the point of absurdity. And it raises the question, if HOAs can fine someone for a snow print, what else could they decide to fine people for? The shape of a shadow? The sound of a lawnmower? A cloud that looks vaguely offensive drifting over the community? The takeaway from Catherine's story is simple. Common sense must guide rule enforcement. Without it, HOAs risk turning their neighborhoods into hostile, laughable environments where homeowners live in fear of fines over things they cannot control. For Catherine, this was just one more example of why HOAs are often seen as antagonists rather than allies. After all, the same HOA that fined her for a snow print had also threatened to tow her car once before, when her registration tags were delayed by just a single day in the mail. When rules lose sight of reason, they stop being rules. They become weapons. The Tennessee snow print story is unforgettable because of its sheer absurdity. It wasn't about property values. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't even about aesthetics. It was about an HOA board so desperate to police its residents that it fined someone for the natural imprint left by snow. For Catherine, the fine was a nuisance. But for the rest of us, it's a chilling reminder. If HOAs can enforce rules this subjectively, then no homeowner is truly safe from their reach. Sometimes, the scariest thing about winter isn't the ice on the roads, it's the HOA waiting to fine you for the way snow falls on your driveway.